We're human, don't you know, just like you are. I'm Rachel Woods, HRBP turned coach, and in this series, I explore the technicolor spectrum that is life in HR with folk in the know, those that have been there, bought the t-shirt, and are happy to share their experiences for us all to benefit. So grab a cuppa, get comfortable, and we'll crack on. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Alastair Swindlehurst. Alastair is the founder of Easy HR. We'll get on to how easy it is in a minute. He is a HR subscription solution provider for SMEs that want to lower the barrier of entry to really good advice. Prior to that, he's spent 15 years working in-house for various blue chip FMCG and manufacturing businesses, along with a number of global BPO organizations. His work across various areas of specialism, including employee relations, organizational change, development, TUPE, and business sale, sounds hugely exciting and probably very familiar to some of you listening. Additionally, he hosts the Alternative Business Review, another podcast. So this is for early stage founders that offers an alternative take on what it's really like founding and growing a business. So Alastair and I got chatting about HR and tech. Possibly divisive, definitely interesting, something to be both aware of and wholly curious about, which is why we're going to discuss that today after a big We're Human welcome to you, Alastair. Hello.
Hello, how are you?
I'm very well. I'm very well. Before we get into the meat of all this, and I'm doing this now, I only decided it the last episode, but I want to do a flashback with all of my guests about what brought them to HR in the first place, what dragged you into the wonderful technicolor world of human resources.
I think like anything, I'll start with a girl. To be honest, I was that is a step before that. My mum used to do personnel back in the day, and I used to hear it come in and go, those scoundrels and those horrible people used to do things, and my ears used to prick up. But that was with no intent of kind of getting involved in kind of personnel, what it was at that time. I was at uni and kind of doing sort of a general business degree, and I saw myself going into kind of HR or marketing at the time. I actually then had visions in terms of going out to America because of a girlfriend that I had at that point. And then 9/11 happened, and I had to make a decision at that point because I thought if I'm going to go to the US, I need an MA to do that. So I made the decision and thought, you know, I'm going to do HR. I did my MA in HR with my CIPD at MMU.
Okay.
And then kind of that fell down, but then found myself working. But I thought, well, if I've sort of got on this horse, I've got to ride it and see what happens.
Okay.
It's and that's kind of it. And then I think it's an interesting one because it's kind of I've now ended up kind of I think because with the course that I did and the area that I did, one of the best things that happened to me in terms of getting into it was actually going working for Sainsbury's
All
at the
right.
start. So sorry, there's someone just come past with a big trolley at the bottom, so I do apologise. The background was because
Tell them to clear off.
I did say we're being a quiet spot. But no, it's kind of I went to work for Sainsbury's, and in that first week of me working for them, we had the order pickers out on strike. It was a warehouse site. The union put a mandate for industrial action. We'd had issues. I looked after the drivers, and we had drivers that the union reps had been dismissed and re-engaged. There was an incredibly confrontational environment,
Mm.
and me being my arrogant and full of kind of vim and vigor individual, I needed some edges knocking off me, which they did. But I also loved it, and I enjoyed the sort of the crazy world of FMCG and manufacturing and HR, and being sort of the rough edge of it.
Yeah, that's a pretty steep. I want to say I wouldn't call it a curve. I'd say it's a steep learning mountain.
Oh
I
no,
mean, particularly with union activity. How do you? I mean, yeah. What was your experience there?
I think it's kind of it's different things because it's like I've always found myself over the years kind of found myself in sort of union or complex environments. So
Mm.
if you I've worked with like the print unions, the baking unions, and it's the one of the things it led me to was actually kind of you can have whatever style and approach that you want, but a lot of this boils down to kind of directness, but not directness in a confrontational way. Kind of just get to the point in hand, and that's
Yeah.
just be honest and transparent about issues. The best the best conversations I have with unions is kind of where you take a collaborative approach, not in terms of saying like let's design an idea, but actually we all want our moment in the sun with this. But also, what I'll do is I'll open all the information up to you. I'll show you exactly what we've got. We won't be dishonest, but I'll also kind of not fluff things up for you as well. And if we can agree a point where we all win in this situation, that's the best outcome, or kind of the best outcome for winning for both parties, because winning's a very subjective concept within this. It's not always gone well with that confrontation, but I've also dealt with some deeply complex stuff as well, which is actually kind of accelerated a lot of the learning that I had when I was doing this.
Yeah, no, that's great. Actually, I'm thinking if I sort of, I know we're going to be about tech, and I'm flashing back to like my first experiences of using technology within an HR role weren't good ones. I mean, they were clunky CRMs, they were clunky recruitment systems and payroll systems, and lots of lovely little workarounds and things that you had to do to make it work in the first place. So, what about you? What drew you to blending technology and digital stuff with the standard HR practice, with normal HR everyday work?
I think everything is a complete process in what you do, and there's I can't ever sit there and say there was like one moment where I went, oh God, you know what I mean? There's a different way of doing things. So I'd say that actually there's a number of layers. One is that kind of in my background in terms of what I did. So I ended up in BPO, and we used to deal with a lot of complex issues. We used to do sort of pre and post acquisition work, and would get involved in some deeply sort of technical issues, and you were forced to explain these things as simply as you could to individuals. And I think it changes the way that you then approach how you just address things more generally, in terms of what you want to do is break process down and get that clear explanation. When I was in house as well, is that I used to do a number of kind of HRIS implementations, and and also I decoupled sort of HR processes from other areas of the business and brought them in centrally. So I went through for a number of years this whole process of actually sitting down and breaking down HR process, to sort of doing the swim lanes and saying, right, we'll do this. Well, this is what we do now. Let's benchmark what we do. And there's a whole process in around kind of actually looking at it in terms of a series of tasks and what you need to do to get to that point. And then I set my own consultancy, and I was going to be a grey man in a grey suit, charging a day rate, and going and doing sort of big projects, and being very serious. And then I can link certain things down to certain conversations. So one of them was kind of a friend of mine who used to work in HR on a number of businesses, and he said that he went and signed up for a major provider one week, and I was like, why have you done that? I said, because you've signed up to a 3-year contract. It's not kind of, it doesn't work for you. And then he went, I just panicked. And then I sat there and I thought, you know what?
Now he's stuck.
Yeah, massively. And it's, but you kind of, having kind of been in the in-house HR person, so working with some SMEs, is that you see this point where there's a point of intervention where people panic, and you see it with smaller HR teams as well. So you kind of, I often talk about kind of Barbara from Wigan that I'm supporting as well. She's the kind of character in my head where I think about as a service provider who we're trying to sort out, who, they don't deal with instance, a lot of stuff on a day-to-day basis. Things only come up time and again. And it's the kind of where do you go to get confidence and understand what's going on. And there was kind of, I saw a bit in terms of being so almost like this normal kind of HR consultancy for SMEs and small HR teams, where you can give the kind of repository of documents and you can give the advice. And I saw an IR35 tool which kind of took you through a decision-making process. And I was like, that can be really quite interesting rather than a how-to guide. And then in terms of the tech that we're building at the moment, we're building automated workflows that we're referring to as a bot. But basically, it's an end-to-end process, which is a decision tree, and it allows you to work through an issue and a problem, and it kind of get you to a point where you can understand what decisions you need to make, what you need to do, what your obligations are within that process. So at least it helps people understand what's in there. The challenge in this is that there's a lot of people that don't feel that there's almost going to be an alchemy, that there's a secret sauce to understanding HR and sort of employment law and mixing it all together. There's definitely an alchemy, but there's not there's nothing, at its core level, you go through a process.
Yeah,
and the kind and kind of how you mix that, and it's kind of how you mix it in with the kind of your morals as a business, rather than kind
absolutely,
of
isn't it? I always used to
yeah
say there's nothing you can't Google. The magic or the trick is in the nuance of applying it within the context of your organization, with the precedents and the culture and everything that goes with that. It's not just about saying what's right and what's wrong. It's about what have we done before? How does this work here? And do we do more than the legal minimum? Do we do much more than that? And therefore, if we just stuck with the legal minimum, that would be pretty grey space for everyone, wouldn't it? So
and I think it's a personal choice, and it's in
yeah,
terms of what is a business that you want to do. It's like I work with some businesses who they see the law as the kind of as the moral as their moral line,
mm,
and to a degree that they're quite honest about it, and people get it and they buy into it. Is it a place I'd want to work? Probably not, but it's kind of for them and for the people they bring in, it makes sense and they're honest about it.
mm.
I think, and it's kind of does it match everything? You almost want the feng shui of what you do with it, and I think that's a big thing for me in terms of taking that approach.
Yeah. So what's Barbara's biggest headache then in her
Oh,
in
that's
her
the
space? Barbara from
and
Wigan. You
Barbara
struggle
from
with.
Wigan, everything that goes wrong. I think one of the things I always go back to is the kind of it's the having access to information. It's understanding that basic process that goes on. If you think about kind of certainly early stages, or if you have things that happen infrequently, it's there's a broad assumption that every HR person should know every process, every detail, and that kind of if you are presented with this, you should in a second just go right, fine, this is what we do. It's not that simple.
No.
If you do not deal with these things on a regular basis, you do not have the muscle memory to deal with these issues. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and your head will pop if you're carrying all that. It's too much. It's too
No,
much.
no, and that's it. If you live and breathe it every day, and you kind of you've got all those kind of short equations in your head, so you know what you need to do. Like it's like I used to do TUPE, and like I extensively people look at me with absolute fear at the sound of TUPE, but then I go, I know what I'm doing, I know how to build it through, and I know what it means. Um, so yeah, it's all the bits and pieces in relation to that. So for me, it's kind of where they don't have the muscle memory on certain issues. It's something that you can dive into and go right quickly, go end to end in a process, understand what you need to do, understand through kind of what the various kind of elements are and kind of the decision points. And I talk about it being like that book as a kid where you get to the end of the page, you make a decision, you go, if you
And
want,
you end up with your fingers in all the different pages.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, you don't. There's
Oh, I
obviously you
did.
don't want to put
I
your
tried to
fingers at the
cheat.
back of the computer. But really, I find that you've not got that vibe in the slightest. But but it is the kind of if you can give people that ability to kind of work through an issue and go right, actually, this is what we need to do. It gives that confidence, and also as well, it's kind of we've tried to kind of release because the tool is basically allows you to take through an end-to-end process. One of the things that I've talked about quite a lot with people is that generally, if something happens, you're having a couple of conversations about the same issue,
Mm,
two, potentially three conversations, because you've got that initial conversation where you actually talk through what the physical process is, and you're getting all this emotion from people where they go, "Oh God, you can't do this," So one's the actual understanding of the process. You then got to go back through the process again where you go, actually, if we're applying our standards to this is what I think we need to do. And I often find that actually the hardest conversation in all of that is running through the process,
mm.
that initial point, because people sit there and go, I don't want to do this. And actually, it's kind of, this isn't, I can't believe I'm being forced to do this. If you can either put something in front of either a manager or in front of a HR professional, they can go, actually, I can work through this process myself. I can acclimatize myself to this process and understand what it is. That second conversation is a hell of a lot easier because they've dealt with it and you're not dealing with that outpouring of emotion. You'll still get some, but it should be a simpler conversation to do that way.
I've got visions of letting the steam off the pot before you can get into the contents almost, just because, like you say, that emotion it messes with things early on, doesn't it? It does make things fuzzy and blurry and hearing is not what it should be at that point in time when the emotions are high. And like you say, you talk about having to repeat yourself and re-explain the process.
Yes.
When it's all simmered down a little bit, it's all more cool and condensed almost.
No, I think like it kind of the simmer part is a really nice way of putting it, because if there's anything that kind of lets a process down, as long as you're doing what you should be doing, it's the emotional people, and whether it's kind of your manager within a process who, like the amount of times where you sit there, someone's trying to get one last punch on someone in a disciplinary process unnecessarily, so when you could have just easily just kind of worked through it, or you've got a employee who's just not reacting in the right way, and you're getting all the emotion that comes out of that. The complications isn't the process. The process is a piece of cake. The complications are people's reactions to the process and how they manage themselves through the process. That you can never get away from that, and that's kind of where that's the beauty of a good HR person. In that instance, you'll move the kind of the pieces around the chessboard to do what you need to do to get that. But I think if you can understand the smartest ways to get through a process and understand the options and why you're doing what you're doing, or enable others to understand it, it kind of makes things a lot easier. But we have this horrible tendency to kind of make people think that what we do is some dark art, and it's not. It's kind of we don't go Hogwarts and sort of figure on the sort of whatever train it is.
Did you not did you not put the hat on and get put in a house?
I think people would have had to put a gag on me and put a hood on me and throw me at the bottom of a river. But it's.
I thought all HR departments had a crystal ball. B, we're well versed in the dark arts. I know we're kind of moving on to the kind of tech space as well, and I know obviously we'll talk about what you do is in your solutions effectively. But are you finding that HR in general is becoming a lot more tech savvy or tech curious, shall we say, as things are evolving? Because I think certainly when I suppose maybe as a result of the bad experiences of different systems and programs that organizations decided to panic and buy and trap you into a 3-year contract with, sort of gives you that slight reticence and reluctance to really get on board with new technologies when they're done to you, or introduced or offered. Are you finding that shifting and changing as things are growing, or are you still finding that little bit of fear remaining?
I think that tech is kind of I think it's too broad a kind of issue to kind of say there's a yes or no in this. So I talk there's like a continuum in this, and it's almost like a U shape. I think there's certain segments where they're well on top of tech, and tech is brilliant, and they're just absolutely nailing it. And I would look at kind of ATSs, I'd say onboarding services, they're great. There's some offboarding solutions, and there's some L&D solutions out there which are just phenomenal in what they do. And there's some brilliant plug and play systems out there as well. And I'd say that kind of with kind of the broader kind of HRISs that are out there as well. If you look at what was out there previously, there's some really great ones that you can just plug in if you're happy just to accept their basic kind of coding processes. They're phenomenal in terms of what you can achieve with very little investment. And actually, they're a lot more flexible than what they used to be. You look at kind of what ADP are doing at the moment in terms of they're making themselves more open source in what they do. They put a marketplace in there. And actually, I think that will feed things like creativity in the market at the moment. But I think it's a journey that we're on. I do think there was a whole challenge in terms of HR grasping tech. And I think that we look at tech and we go, tech is HR information system. HR information isn't tech. It is tech because it's a digital solution.
Digitized, isn't it? So
yeah. But there's so much more we can do with it, and there's so much more deeper thinking. And the way I describe it is like this big U in terms of you kind of there's two scales. You kind of got going up the vertical axis. You kind of go from small, medium to enterprise, and then you go across from kind of the onboarding to the offboarding piece. There's like almost an end that goes across where kind of everyone's nailed down the onboarding piece, regardless of whether you're a small business or you're a large business. Everyone's nailed the onboarding piece in terms of offboarding piece, or in terms of whether you're small or large. They've got the whole end-to-end sorted out for a large and enterprise level. And there's some great stuff in the BAU section, but there's a big hole in the middle where you get into the kind of the nitty gritty sort of day-to-day stuff in terms of disciplinary grievances, actually looking at how do you manage, understand processes, what does advice look like, kind of how do you give depth of knowledge to these things. There's very few people looking at that. Some businesses are creating their own, but that's in the enterprise space. It's not at the small to medium space. And I think there are a lot of small businesses where you've got teams of 100 or less. And I'm not talking HR teams, I'm talking businesses of 100 or less, or a couple hundred or less, who just haven't got the budget to access the implementation costs to get to this. There is more, there should be cheaper alternatives out there, because again, what we're doing isn't rocket science. It's just having the capability to break these down in a way that it becomes accessible. People can understand it, and then you enable people to make decisions. You enable people to understand and engage with the process more effectively.
Yeah.
But I think there is and we've spoken obviously before this podcast, and kind of one of my challenges, I think, kind of HR is a bit of an existential crisis as well, because it's almost, if you engage in tech, are you taking the kind of the human, the people aspect out of HR? And I don't think it necessarily has to be that. I think there's a place for it, because it facilitates rather than replaces. But we need to understand actually what do we want from tech, because we say that we do tech, but I don't feel that we do tech. We do digital processes, and there's two very different things.
So what does Barbara want? I'm going to go back to Barbara's story. Barbara's in this an SME, a minimal budget to bring in any kind of new systems and support pieces to help her do her job. So she's in her office in Wigan and looking at her workload and things that are coming down the line, challenges that she might have with the organisation and stuff and the people and the individuals within it. What does she need, or what does she want, and what does she need? I suppose there might be two different things, maybe. But
no, and I always talk about Barbara from Wigan. I can always there is a Barbara from Wigan that I knew, and I knew that whenever I rang them, there was a problem. I could hear her teeth suck at that precise moment of time. She goes,
yeah,
and you go, it's not that.
I always feel her eyes rolling.
Yeah, no, I could hear the withering comments as she went. She was like, not another one. And I say that as someone from Bolton, so I'm equally six-fingered and from over the hill as well. So don't worry, I'm a weirdo from the hills. For me, it's about enablement of information. So there's lots of information out there at the moment, and I would argue that kind of there's lots of opinion pieces, but there's nothing that you get to which actually says this is a process and this is how you break down a process. I've had some of my clients use sort of tech that we're using, and a really interesting way of putting it was kind of, someone described it as like a supersized FAQs. And for me, that's probably the best way of doing it, in terms of what you want to be able to see is kind of, if I'm here in this process and this event has happened, what's my obligation within this? What do I need to do to achieve to get to the end point? And what does the end point do? What are my decision points within this process? So where am I going to have to kind of do this? But something kind of, where are there opportunities for me to kind of not get out of the process, but kind of put less onerous obligations on myself within this? You know what I mean? I always talk about flexible working being the most interesting one, where people get flexible working requests and they just accept a flexible working request. Actually, there's all these pre-qualifying questions before we even get to that point, where a lot of people don't even think to kind of get into that. So it's kind of going through those pre-qualifying questions. Then there's that initial risk of, actually, is that a returning mother? Is it someone who's got care responsibilities, who's with someone with a disability? You know, at that point, there's an obvious intervention point, where if you've got someone who's dealing with that type of issue, you've got to respond to that person in the right way. So, you know, going through a bot isn't the smartest thing to do. You need good, considered advice. And it's also flagging at people, saying, actually, you know, you shouldn't, if you're not sure what you're talking about, you should be speaking to someone to get the right advice. And then as you work through that again, it's like, if you don't need that advice, it's pretty straightforward. But if you're rejecting it, you know, there's the standard reasons to not approve it, and it's making sure people understand what those are. But then it's also about the kind of if you're in the meetings, what are those exploratory questions for people? You know, just because someone's put I don't want to work Fridays down as a flexible working rest. The issue is that they've only got childcare for 4 days of the week off, but they can only afford childcare for 4 days of the week.
Yeah.
It's not the kind of hell bent on Friday. They just thought, well, actually, if I'm doing it, I'd like to have a 3-day weekend if I could do. So actually, the other view is that, well, do take Mondays off instead. You know, there's different ways to cut the cake. And what we try and do within the tool is give that mixture of kind of statutory process, legal guide, pull people out kind of where it's we going, actually, no, kind of, we need to kind of have a conversation in here. But suddenly kind of, these are the questions you need to think about.
Yeah.
And it's trying to put a blend of solutions in there which help facilitate and educate. And then you can either run a process through it if you need to, and you can use it as that crutch to sort of lean back into, or at least you can then put it in front of managers to kind of then they can understand the process and they can do what they need to do. And also as well, it's something to feed back into other people in terms of managers to go kind of, when you take them through a process and, they go hammering in the hands on the air, they go, oh my God, I can't believe you're asking me to do that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's then a way of enablement of that. It's, for me, that's the big thing. It's not a really short, succinct answer. I struggle to do this.
If I was going to nutshell it, I mean, does this save Barbara from getting embroiled in things that should have quite a simple answer?
Yes.
Yeah, and ultimately then she can focus her attentions on the things that need the human touch. Like you say, the more complex requests, the requests from, like say, parents with caring responsibilities, and the more sensitive things that are there, and less about how do I work my holiday out? How much have I got left? That kind of stuff. But which are very common HR questions, let's face it, when somebody can't be bothered to look it up for themselves.
I think it's the other side of that. It's a way not to feel overwhelmed by process as well.
Yeah.
Because it's, if you think about it as Barbara from Wigan, if you only have a disciplinary a couple of times a year, you won't have the muscle memory. And it's the bit where if you're sitting in front of a manager and you've got to kind of have that air of confidence in terms of what you need to do through the process. If you're not 100% sure, it's just having something there that you can lean on. You've worked through the process, you understand the decision points, you understand the questions. You know what I mean? It gives
saves that trawling back through the ACAS website to remind yourself of how it all works. You've got something that leads you through it naturally.
And let's be quite honest. Like ACAS, they are a business that's variable. If we're being honest, I've known some great people within ACAS who've been phenomenal, and they've supported me in my career. I've also kind of dealt with some people which I've been less than taken with. If I'm being
they're online. I'm not knocking them. Their online guides can be very useful, but ultimately, if you've got something built into your everyday working patterns, everyday working life that you're familiar with, that has the same answers, that has those processes mapped in already, you're not then having to go to the ACAS website to look at their guide to disciplinary hearings, because you've got the process mapped in already to.
Yeah, and I think for what we try to do is kind of take the best of bits from the ACAS, because there's certain core things you just can't get away from.
Yeah.
But then there's a commerciality with decisions, and there's a pragmatism to decisions that ACAS, in fairness, don't offer, because they're not there to offer that level of advice. And I think there's a different element there, because actually I personally I always panic a little bit when people say that they use ACAS as their primary source of information.
Yeah.
And I think because ACAS is great to a point, but it's limited. And there would be, if you want kind of everything to the kind of the law and no scope for kind of additional decision making in there.
Yeah, we don't map in company policies to ACAS. It's a list of must-dos, isn't it? And some best practice. If you have precedent and policy within your organisation that adds to that and says, yes, we will do this, and ACAS says, what you think about a classic example, who can you bring to a hearing with you? ACAS are very black and white, union rep or fellow colleague, right? A lot of organisations will say, we don't mind who you bring.
Yes, and the thing
don't mind who you bring, as long as you feel supported, and that's a lovely addition beyond the minimum requirement, isn't it? But like you say, if you look at just ACAS, minimum requirement, that's it.
And that's the thing for me is that people just look at stuff on a kind of very black and white level and go, I've checked the ACAS ACOPs and done, and it's just like no. there's context, there's texture, there's bits within this, and this is where the real alchemy is understanding and recognizing those triggers. It's not the process. It's kind of it's how you bring that together, and it's the to kind of go back to your original point in terms of this is the bit where I think that kind of this is why HR doesn't really engage tech in the way that it should do is because in a weird way we kind of we look at tech at taking away that decision making process.
I was going to say that is the fear of chatbots replacing people in some ways, or human, not people as such, but and I think we talked about this, didn't we, when we kind of starting this session up around how you humanize a chatbot or an online chat or a filtration system in order to get the right issues, the right things to that human face-to-face or phone or Zoom contact, and filter out the things that actually are less reliant on that, I suppose. And I think we talked about how you use language to humanize that inquiry system, if you like, the thing that the end user goes to first, if that's how they get HR attention. How do you humanize that?
Completely. And I think within the bot, we've got one kind of reaction to, I think it's the disciplinary process where we go kind of, it's serious, which is kind of like, it's the gross misconduct one. And sometimes, it's interesting if a few people kind of replay our language back to us recently, which has made me think about a few things. But there's a tendency actually that we get lost in this kind of sounding very officious, and we follow the ACAS guideline, and we use HR language. No. There's a danger if we sound more detached than enabling. And actually, sometimes on a really basic level, sugar has gone wrong. You know what I mean? And
it's really bad.
Yeah,
it's simple as that. It's really bad.
There's a handcart currently descending into hell. You know what I mean? There is that is a response. You know what I mean? And I would argue that a bot in that situation is of no use. But similarly, kind of my bot is not a bot in terms of AI. There's very little real AI out there. You know what I mean? Most AI that you see kind of on that platform is kind of someone in a kind of remote center plugging away in the background. I'm very clear in terms of the AI, the bot that we use is actually kind of, it is a workflow that sits in the background. We've got predetermined actions and behaviors that sit in there, and it doesn't deviate from that because
so a dynamic decision tree, effectively.
Yeah, completely. Yeah. But we don't want independent thinking because we've got a clear, unless we get the bonfire in workers' rights that's apparently coming at the end of 2023. Let's see if we get to with that. We've got there is a predefined kind of decision making process in this, and that applies a basic standard. There's the risk and the compliance that you apply to that decision making tree. That's a different conversation. But there's a general accepted standard which you can go, right, this is what you do. And these are really bad decisions. These are really good, these are enabling decisions. Don't do the bad decisions, because if you do the bad decisions, you will be in trouble.
It'll be really bad. Yes. I like that. Yes. And I like that humanizing language, because I think you're right. You use some of these other services, other industries, and they are frustratingly formal sometimes. And you just think, for God's sake, just let me speak to someone. And if you're allowing that option to be much more, actually, this is, if I can answer your question straight away and see you through, then great. But for the more complex matters, like say disciplinary grievances, complaints, conflicts, you're going to want to escalate to an actual human being quite quickly, aren't you?
Completely. And it's from my point of view, is that kind of we're not replacing the human in this, and there's still there's a complexity and depth of issues that still need you need someone to sit there and go, you need to drop an experienced person in there, or someone that understands the business. And it's not necessarily kind of legal understanding, it's kind of understanding the environment and kind of what is driving the sort of environmental factors, because you need to kind of make this work in the business you're in. And sometimes we've all been in that position where not that you sort of say tally ho and kind of completely ruin the face of process, but there is a moral position to take in terms of taking a strong position with people. So you can't actually sit there, you maybe err on the side of, you don't err on the side of coaching process, and you go, I know we're going to get criticised, but it's more important that we say we won't accept this standard of behaviour than actually let it go. You know what I mean? And there's certain reality that, and you have to bypass that. And I think we need to be a bit more open about this as a business. And this is for me is about risk and compliance, because there's risk and compliance that you take to a process. Sometimes you don't want to. You want to engage in a little bit more risk in a process, and that means that you're slightly less compliant to a process. But there is a cigarette paper between being uncompliant and being completely kind of cavalier in what you do. And where you kind of go, we just need to get to this end outcome, and we'll do as much as we can to kind of wash our faces with this. And this is understanding the process. And I think it's understanding those pinch points and where those major dangers lie within that process as well.
Yeah. So what would you be inviting HR teams, anyone listening to this that's in an HR team, saying, actually, this is quite intriguing, be an interesting piece to think about as a team. What do we do, and how do we apply this sort of thinking to our processes at the moment, and where are our stress points, where are our eye roll moments, and our we could do some pressure release around these sorts of areas? What would you invite them to start thinking about as they look at what they can put into practice in the future to face things that are coming down the line? Let's face it, when things get tight, and the environment right now is people are going to start struggling, and that's when we do see behaviours manifesting in the workplace, isn't it? Let's face it. So teams facing into that.
One thing
what would you invite them to think about? What would you invite them to be curious on?
I think so. I would say kind of there's policy and process in what we do. I would challenge to say that do we actually write a policy and process when we do these things? I'd say we write a policy. I would encourage people to look at process at the moment, because have you ever actually written down a piece of paper and actually mapped out what you do step by step in a process, and what influences your decision making? I would argue that the only times that I've done that is kind of when I've either done a complete decouple of a HR function and you're moving it from one team to another, or when you go through a HRIS implementation. It's very rare that you look at people and go, what is our process? Because we don't want to believe that we're in a process. We don't do a process. We take all these factors, we mix it in, we put it in a cauldron, and we mix it together, and it comes out. And it's this alchemy. That to me is incorrect, because there is a process that part of that. You have standard behaviours, you have a standard operating, a system of work that you work to, and you have got core beliefs and behaviours within a business that drive that. Are they working for you? Because generally, if you aren't getting to the outcomes that you want to, I'd say that your processes aren't correct. Yeah. And then once you understand what your process is, your policy is written around that. We start far too many times where we try and correct behaviour with policy. Yeah. Policy should be a light touch. Policy should articulate what you do, and it is just used incorrectly. And if there's anything that makes my kind of wee go a bit stronger than it should do, with it go a bit warm, it's that, you know what I mean? We don't look at, behaviour is kind of what you do, and it's what you do day to day. It's things like such as culture. Culture is not a document. It's what you do. It's kind of what you do on days ending in Y. It's kind of yeah. Sorry.
No, I'm with you there. I mean, culture is a very fascinating piece, and particularly when it comes to, the application of whether it's policy or process, the application of the process within a policy or an action can vary hugely as a result of the organizational culture, and the expectations of the individuals vary hugely. Culture. A very experienced HRD friend of mine, a mentor to me years ago, used to say at new organizations she went to, she'd go and literally sit in the ladies with the door shut and listen to the conversations, because she got a better idea of the corporate culture by doing that than looking at the signs on the wall or talking to the exec. It was, is the culture felt and lived at that level? And those ad hoc conversations were absolute gold. I wouldn't suggest everyone goes and does that, because you would look a bit weird after a while. But for her, it was just actually the key insights I got from overhearing some stuff. Some of it a bit shocking, because I wouldn't ever use that. It just gave me an inkling of what's actually going on in the organisation versus what the board would tell me or the interviewer was saying about how wonderful and lovely it was with everyone, particularly in HR.
Completely, because like one of my questions I always ask people at interviews, kind of when I'm helping people, is kind of tell me about when things have gone wrong.
Yeah.
because you know we have a tendency to kind of look on the bright side of things, you know, and that's great. But you know, we're not putting we generally in jobs to recover situations because something has happened which we didn't anticipate, and there's nothing wrong in things going wrong. But kind of the testament of what you do as a person is your ability to interject either at an early or a late stage and recover the situation and get it back on track. You know what I mean? That's what we spend a lot of our time doing, and I think that kind of it almost makes you sound miserable. Kind of like is the bit where you kind of like you want to talk about when things have got hellish, when you've seen the handcart head into hell, and it's the kind of well, yeah, you know what I mean. This is I saw it rolling down the hill, and then I went and grabbed it, and this is what I did to go and grab it. You know, we don't want to have that conversation,
And it's funny,
and
isn't
we're
it? Because the real test of an organization or an individual's mettle is how you respond or react, depending on which you choose, to something when it's not going as well as you would like it to be going.
yeah, and it's kind of
Um,
if I again to kind of call back to another of your questions is that the majority of people kind of feel overwhelmed by process. You know what I mean? If I look at kind of the reason why people go to ACAS or they kind of come to a business like myself is that they feel lost within the process, and there's probably a number of factors in terms of they think they should be doing something else because they've read something elsewhere which tells them like what the best practice is, but then they'll go somewhere else, and there's no consistent position of what process is. If you can give people a really kind of down and dirty kind of as a minimum requirement, this is what you need to do, and even using the phrase down and dirty, kind of it seems like it's kind of a legal minimum requirement. It is and it isn't, but it's kind of you have a choice of whether you pull yourself down to it or you build up. My view is that you build up if you know kind of where the entry point is. You've then got the space to play with things, and you can do interesting things, and you can say use your imagination. You can use your brain and use that thing to say actually, how do I make this the best outcome for me in the business? You know, in that, and we don't we don't always ask that question, or I don't see other HR professionals necessarily asking that question. In my experience, is probably is the better way
no,
to describe
I
that.
think that's fair. I think it's very fair. I'm really conscious of time, and I think
Yeah.
we could cover this for a really long time. There's so much here. But I think we very kind of brought ourselves onto it very, very usefully, I think, to shameless plug, because I do actually think that what you are promoting and trying to get out there to support HR teams is a really interesting space to be in. I think it's a really valuable space for HR teams and individuals to start looking at to make their lives better, easier, much more, like you say, straightforward in terms of clarity of understanding for all parties concerned, not just, easier for the HR bods
Mm.
that are involved. Anyone coming into an HR process of some sort or trying to get their heads around a policy that, like you say, may have been written, it's 48 pages and it's all very wordy and nobody really gets it. So what is it that you would like to say in a nutshell about what you're offering right now, and how can people get in touch with you to find out more?
So what we do is kind of we work with SMEs, and we also plug into the back of HR teams, and basically kind of we are that kind of second line support is the way I describe it, and we'll kind of plug in with you guys. We can give you access to the platform and the tech, and you can then access it through that way. I think the big point of difference is that kind of it's that giving confidence, and I think if you are someone that doesn't have issues on a regular basis and kind of that you feel these things are irregular and you just want to try and give you kind of put a bit more strength in the system with that type of business. I think often I find that kind of our most powerful way of kind of interacting with people obviously isn't the tech, it's just that quick conversation where someone goes, you know what I mean? And then we can explore what that issue is. And, we'll find a way through it by hook or by crook, and we'll give you options to go with that. So if you want to get in contact, the website is ezhr.uk. Remember, don't put the co in there. We've just purchased the domain because I've got it a lot cheaper than what was originally quoted.
Okay.
Customers come into contact with this. You can find me on Twitter under HR Tinker. So that's my Twitter handle.
Oh, I like that.
There's a long and complicated story about a pseudonym and tweeting and blogging is not myself, and kind of this probably says more about my kind of deep psychosis than anything else. And then if you need to find the business we're on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok as well at EZHR UK. So we do regular Friday updates. Like the big thing. Well, if I wanted to kind of describe business in a word, it's being useful.
Yeah.
Or just useful. I think we aim to be useful. We aim to help, and that useful is as simple as I do a regular Friday video where we just simply go, here's what's happening in HR this week, of the things that sit around HR. It's not every piece of information, but it's the things that are probably important to you if you're running a business. And one thing that we've not talked about in this, and that I hear very few HR people talk about, is that either your biggest or your second biggest cost within a business is people.
Mm.
I see the lack of, we don't always take that obligation seriously. And if someone said to me kind of like, how much time does someone spend on people issues? Actually, if you're a manager, it's 100% your time.
Mm.
So how seriously are you taking these things? And actually, if you can be useful on this stuff, it's kind of, that's a really good place to be.
Fantastic. We will put all of those links in the show notes so you can access those at any time and find out more information. And I'll certainly be following you on Instagram because I do like to have my finger on the pulse when it comes to new stuff that's coming down the line, or thoughts about old stuff that's been around for years and we're still trying to work out how to handle it, let's face it. Thank you very much, Alastair, for your time. This has been absolutely fantastic. And thank you for everyone for listening. If you like this, do subscribe. I think there's a little bell or something wherever you happen to be listening. Certainly on my website, there's something you can press to be notified when new episodes come out. So thanks a lot. Thanks for listening, and big fat thank you to Alastair.